The journey of the Viking warrior. The Vikings, known for their immense courage and naval skill, not only conquered lands, but also wrote stories of bravery and wit. Imagine a young warrior, still in his early stages of combat, boarding an imposing ship bound for unknown lands. He did not know exactly what awaited him, but the promise of riches and the chance to earn the respect of his people fueled his courage. At that moment, faith in his gods and the strength of his sword were all he needed. Like so many other Vikings, he was willing to risk everything in the name of honor and family. As the ship cut through the icy waters of the north, the young warrior reflected on the teachings passed on by his father, who spoke of legendary battles and the gods who ruled the destinies of men. However, he knew that the real fight did not happen only on the battlefield, but in the soul of the warrior. Every choice, every action, reflected his loyalty to his tribe and his desire to be remembered in history as those who had forged empires and left an everlasting legacy. When he first saw the shores of a new land, his heart leapt. He knew that this was more than a conquest. It represented the fulfillment of a destiny that had been forged long before his birth. In the midst of battle, as his axe cut through his enemies and his sword caught the sunlight, the young warrior understood something profound about life. True glory lay not in winning alone, but in knowing that his actions, his courage, and his honor would endure, long after his last breath. His journey was far from over, but each step brought him closer to becoming a legend. And like all the Vikings who came before him, he knew that once his name was immortalized, nothing else would matter. History, after all, was written by the hands of the brave. Erik, the young Viking warrior, felt the weight of destiny on his shoulders as he prepared to face the challenges that awaited him in distant lands. As the ship touched down on the solid ground of an unknown island, the sound of waves crashing against the shore echoed in his ears. His eyes, once filled with uncertainty, now shone with determination. He knew that the true test would not only be the physical battle, but also the resilience of the spirit. Each step in the new land would be an achievement, an affirmation of his courage. And of course, he desired more than land and riches. What Erik truly sought was the respect of the great leaders, who would one day be his equals, alongside the greatest warriors in history. As he walked through the strange land, Erik reflected on the teaching of his father, a respected leader in his village. A true warrior fears not death, but shame. This remained engraved in his mind, making him face the world with greater intensity. Over the next few days, he faced challenges that tested his limits, from traversing dense forests to fighting wild beasts. But the greatest battle was yet to come, an encounter with a fierce rival, a warrior leader of an enemy tribe that threatened the land where Erik and his companions had set foot. This leader's name was Ragnar, a man whose reputation for invincibility spread faster than the wind. Erik knew that this confrontation would be the test of his bravery and the true strength that lived in his heart. When the day of battle arrived, the field was shrouded in deathly silence. Erik looked at his companions, each with their own story and ambition, and remembered a final lesson from his father. The true battle is fought in the heart of man, before it is fought on the battlefield. He knew that more than the strength of his arm, it was the determination of his soul that would make him prevail. When the first war cries echoed and the battle began, Erik did not think of victory or defeat, but of the legacy that he, and his sword, would leave on that field. Honor was his only reward, and he was ready to fight for it. When the battle finally ended, Erik found himself standing, breathing heavily and his body covered in scars. The fight with Ragnar, the enemy leader, had been harder than he had imagined. However, the sound of the sword breaking through Ragnar's defenses rang like music to Erik's ears. He had won, but not through brute force, but through the strength of his spirit, which never wavered. The weight of victory did not fall upon him immediately. Instead, a strange feeling came over the young warrior. Victory was not just about defeating the enemy, but about conquering something greater. Erik knew that by defeating Ragnar, he was not just conquering a land, but a place in the pantheon of the greatest warriors in Viking history. In the days that followed, Erik received the respect he sought. His name began to spread throughout the tribes, and the great leaders who had once been his idols now saw him as an equal. He was hailed as a hero, and his axe, which had previously represented only the promise of war, now symbolized his strategic skill and mental strength. What had once seemed like a simple challenge of war turned into a journey of self-discovery. Erik began to realize that true victory lay in the way he transformed each experience into a learning experience, each combat into an opportunity for growth. However, the young Viking did not allow himself to be intoxicated by glory. He knew that achievements and recognition were temporary. His spirit sought something beyond earthly victories, something that transcended the boundaries of fame. He yearned for wisdom, to understand the mysteries of the world and the ways of the gods. It was not long before Erik realized that in order to continue his journey, he would need something deeper than the simple desire for power. His next challenge would be to discover the true purpose of his existence, something that went beyond battles and conquered lands. Something that, he knew, could only be achieved when he found true connection with his spirit. After his great victory and the recognition of his name, Erik felt that he had achieved everything a warrior could wish for. However, within himself, an emptiness began to grow. He knew that there was more to be discovered, something that transcended the battlefields and the conquered lands. It was then that, one starry night, while reflecting on the future, he heard about a reclusive shaman who lived in the mountains, a man who claimed to be able to transmit wisdom beyond human comprehension. Driven by curiosity and the need to find a greater purpose, Erik decided to set out on a solitary journey in search of this shaman. The journey through the mountains was not easy. Erik faced dangers that tested his physical and mental endurance. However, each step brought him closer to something greater. The biting wind, the treacherous rocks, and the loneliness could not break his determination. After days of walking, he finally reached a small hut, where he met the shaman. The man, who looked old but had piercing eyes full of wisdom, looked at Erik and, without saying a word, indicated that he should sit down. There, in silence, Erik began to realize that true wisdom did not come from words, but from the ability to listen and reflect on what was around him. Then the shaman began a profound teaching on the cycles of life and nature, explaining that every warrior, no matter how strong, needed to understand the balance between physical strength and spirituality. Erik, who until then believed that his strength was measured by the number of enemies defeated, realized that true strength lay in his ability to master himself and understand the flow of the world around him. During the weeks that followed, Erik learned valuable lessons about patience, wisdom, and the importance of connecting with the earth and the elements. But the shaman also warned him. The greatest challenge will come when you need to use your strength not to destroy, but to protect. And with that, Erik understood that his journey was far from over. After months spent in the mountains, absorbing the shaman's teachings, Erik returned to his homeland, wiser and more centered. However, the world outside the mountains was still not at peace. During his absence, a new threat had arisen, a coalition of enemy tribes who had banded together with the sole purpose of destroying Erik's village and taking his lands. When he heard the news, a renewed fire ignited within him. The lessons he had learned could not be forgotten, but war was imminent, and Erik knew that his role as a leader and warrior would be crucial. His axe was sharp, and his spirit, stronger than ever, was ready to lead his men into the greatest battle of their lives. The first battles were difficult and bloody. The enemy tribes, well organized and aggressive, attacked with ferocity. But Erik, now more strategic, knew that victory would not come through brute force alone. He used his wisdom to understand the enemy's movements and plan each attack with precision. He led his men with courage and compassion, ensuring that his forces were united not only by the sword, but by mutual trust and honor. One of the fiercest battles took place in the hills north of his village, where the outnumbered enemy attempted to surround them. Erik used the strategy of attacking by surprise at night, extinguishing their fires and moving his troops silently. When the enemy least expected it, the Viking force fell upon them, defeating them decisively. Despite the initial victories, the greatest challenge was yet to come. The enemy coalition, weakened but not defeated, gathered its forces for a final assault. The tribal leaders, now led by a warrior even more feared than Ragnar, prepared to lay siege to Erik's village, hoping to crush him once and for all. Erik's lands were about to be invaded, and he knew that this would be the battle that would define his legacy. In a moment of silence before the fight, Erik looked at his men and remembered the words of the shaman. The true warrior fights not only to conquer, but to protect what is precious. He then raised his sword to the sky and, with a war cry, led his people into the bloodiest battle of all. The final battle against the enemy coalition was an epic battle that lasted for days. The battlefield was covered in blood and dust, with the sound of clashing swords and war cries echoing all around. Erik, at the head of his men, fought with unstoppable ferocity, his axe cutting down any enemy that came near. But as the fight dragged on, he began to realize that victory would not be a matter of mere physical strength. His strength was dwindling, his men were exhausted, and the enemy seemed increasingly determined. It was then that Erik, in a moment of clarity, understood that victory would require more than simply defeating his enemies. It would require sacrifice. In an act of pure courage, Erik made a decision that would change everything. He knew that to ensure the survival of his people and their final victory, he would need to draw the enemy leader into a direct duel. He broke away from his troops, heading toward the leader of the coalition, who was waiting for him with an arrogant smile. The battle between the two was intense, a game of strength, skill, and strategy. Erik, though wounded, used all the wisdom he had learned in the mountains, observing his enemy's movements, waiting for the right moment. Finally, with a precise blow, he felled the enemy leader, destroying the coalition once and for all. However, this victory had its price. Erik was seriously wounded, and his forces were almost exhausted. Despite his wounds, the victory was overwhelming. With the enemy leader defeated, the remaining tribes surrendered or fled far away, leaving Erik's village alone. His name would become legendary, not only for his strength, but for the sacrifice he made to protect his people. The village was saved, but Erik knew that the real war had not been against external enemies, but against his own fears and limitations. He had conquered more than land or fame. He had achieved true greatness. Now, in his weakened state, he understood that the true leader is one who sacrifices himself for the good of others, and that the greatest battle is always the one fought within oneself. After the great victory, Erik was welcomed as a hero by his village. However, he knew that the real task was just beginning. The scars of war ran deep, and while victory assured his people's safety, their future was not assured. The village, now at peace, needed to rebuild, and Erik saw himself not just as a warrior, but as a leader. He knew that leadership was not just about commanding in battle, but about making difficult decisions, looking out for the well-being of his people, and guiding them through times of prosperity and adversity. Over the next few months, he devoted himself to reorganizing the village, providing support to the wounded, helping to build new homes, and cultivating alliances with neighboring tribes that had once been enemies. But the true test of Erik's leadership came when a new threat arose, one very different from the ones before. A great famine struck the region, and the crops failed. The survival of his village was at stake. Many suggested leaving in search of new lands, but Erik knew that the answer lay not in flight, but in facing the challenge with intelligence and courage. He called together the best hunters and farmers, and together they discovered ways to hunt more effectively and find alternative sources of food. Erik also organized expeditions to establish new trade routes with distant tribes, bringing back essential resources for survival. Hunger, which seemed an unstoppable force, was defeated by the unity and determination of Erik's people. In time, Erik's village not only recovered, but prospered as never before. Riches began to flow in, and Erik's name spread throughout the region. He came to be seen not only as a formidable warrior, but as a visionary leader who had known how to lead his people to times of peace and prosperity. But more than any material achievement, Erik's greatest legacy was what he taught his people. A leader's true strength comes not from his ability to win battles, but from his ability to unite and guide his people in times of crisis. And so, Erik's name became a legend, not only for his victories in combat, but for the example of courage, sacrifice, and wisdom he left for future generations. Although his village prospered, Erik knew that the Viking spirit was restless and that the search for new lands and opportunities was inevitable. One starry night, he gathered his best men and announced that it was time to sail beyond the waters they knew. He believed that by exploring distant lands, they could not only expand their wealth, but also learn from different cultures and strengthen their position as one of the greatest clans in the region. So, with ships built from the strongest timber and carefully organized provisions, Erik and his crew set sail for the unknown, leaving behind their families and the promise of returning with glory. The journey was anything but easy. Treacherous winds and rough seas tested the resolve of Erik and his crew. For weeks, they endured storms that nearly destroyed their ships, and hunger began to haunt his men. But Erik, with his unwavering leadership, kept morale high, reminding everyone of the promise of fertile lands and riches beyond imagination. Finally, after many trials, they sighted an unknown coast. It was a land of green hills, dense forests, and mighty rivers. But the tranquility of the landscape was deceiving, for they soon discovered that they were not alone. Local tribes, suspicious and hostile, were preparing to defend their lands against the foreigners who had arrived. Erik knew that a confrontation was inevitable, but he also understood that war was not always the best answer. He tried to establish dialogue with the leaders of the local tribes, offering alliances and trade. However, tensions were high, and negotiations failed. When the first attack was launched, Erik led his men with the same courage as always, but with a new strategy: capture without destruction. He instructed his warriors to incapacitate their enemies rather than kill them, showing respect for life and laying the groundwork for a future alliance. This act of wisdom proved decisive. After defeating the local defenders, Erik spared their leaders and once again proposed peace, this time with gestures of good faith that impressed even the most skeptical. Thus the first Viking colony outside their homelands was established, and Erik once again demonstrated that true power came from unity and the ability to turn enemies into allies. The success of the new colony brought not only prosperity, but also attracted the attention of distant kingdoms. Messengers began to arrive, bringing rumors that a great confederation was forming to resist Viking expansion. Erik knew that this alliance could pose an existential threat not only to his newly established colony, but also to his home village. It was a delicate situation. Retreating would mean losing everything they had gained, but advancing would require courage and brilliant strategy. Without hesitation, Erik decided to rise to the challenge. He summoned reinforcements from his village and prepared an army that would be remembered for generations. Before the confrontation, Erik showed his skill not only as a warrior, but as a strategist. He carefully studied the movements of his enemies, sending spies to understand their tactics and weaknesses. When the great enemy army finally marched to face him, Erik divided his forces into small groups, setting up ambushes in familiar terrain. In one of the most decisive battles, he personally led a surprise nighttime attack, capturing the enemy's main camp and completely disorganizing their forces. The victory was overwhelming, but Erik knew that this was only the beginning. The leaders of the Confederacy were still alive, and a final showdown was inevitable. The final battle took place on a vast field where the forces of both sides had gathered. The battle was fierce, with the clash of swords and war cries echoing across the valleys. Erik, amidst the chaos, seemed like a force of nature, leading his men with almost superhuman courage. At a critical moment, he faced the leader of the Confederacy in a duel that would decide the fate of all. The combat was evenly matched, with both men displaying incredible skill. But at the last moment, Erik found an opening and struck down his opponent. With that, the enemy forces scattered, and the victory was complete. Erik, once again, proved that his leadership was the key to turning challenges into conquests. With his victory in the Battle of the Realms, Erik's name became legendary. Poets began to sing of his achievements, and messengers from distant lands sought his presence, offering alliances and treaties. His colony flourished, and his home village became a center of power and commerce. But Erik knew that with glory came new burdens. Rivals lurked in the shadows, jealous of his rise, and even within his own ranks there were those who questioned his leadership. Peace, as always, was an invisible battlefield, where wisdom and vigilance became his most powerful weapons. Erik realized that he could not simply react to challenges. He had to anticipate them. So he set about strengthening his governance. He created councils of local leaders, where every decision was debated and approved, uniting the clan in a common purpose. He also sent out explorers to map new lands and resources, ensuring that his nation always had something to offer in trade and alliances. But he did not abandon his warrior roots. In regular training sessions, he taught his men not only to fight, but to understand strategy and maintain discipline, creating an army that was both intelligent and unbeatable. Despite his precautions, a new challenge emerged from the north. Rumors of a colossal enemy fleet spread like wildfire through the villages. They were dissident Vikings, led by an old rival of Erik's, who sought to overthrow him and take his place. Erik knew this confrontation would be different. It was not just about defending lands, but about protecting the legacy he had built. He called his allies, prepared his forces, and before he set out, he gathered his people for a memorable speech. He spoke of sacrifice, courage, and the dream of a future where his children would live free and prosper. As the sun set over the horizon, Erik led his ships toward the confrontation that would define not only his life, but the fate of all who trusted him. The icy winds cut like blades as Erik's fleet sailed to meet the enemy. He knew that the battle would not only be a matter of strength, but also of wits and courage. His scouts brought back valuable information. The opposing fleet was larger, composed of fierce warriors, but lacking the discipline that Erik had cultivated in his men. He gathered his captains for a war council on the main deck and devised a bold strategy. Rather than face the enemy head-on, he would use his knowledge of the sea currents and terrain to divide and weaken their forces. When dawn revealed the enemy, Erik executed his plan. He sent small boats to lower part of the opposing fleet toward treacherous reefs, where the larger ships would be stranded. Meanwhile, Erik's main force attacked in a coordinated fashion, striking at the vulnerable flanks of the rival fleet. Chaos ensued among the dissidents. Erik, with his unparalleled skill, led the front line, inspiring his men with every precise strike and strategic command. At a crucial moment, he found his rival leader on a burning ship, and the two faced off in an epic duel on a slippery, blood-stained deck. The fight was fierce, with swords clanging and sparks flying with every clash of metal. The rival, driven by ambition and hatred, fought like a man possessed, but Erik kept his cool. With one precise blow, he disarmed his opponent and felled him. He could have killed him on the spot, but in an unexpected gesture, he offered him mercy. The rival, humiliated and defeated, swore loyalty. This act of greatness cemented not only Erik's victory, but also his reputation as a just leader, capable of uniting even his enemies. As the last enemy ship retreated, Erik's men raised their weapons and shouted in triumph. But Erik was not carried away by the euphoria. He knew that this victory was just another step in building a lasting future. As he looked out over the horizon, he noticed that the waters that had been the scene of so much blood were now calm, as if nature itself recognized the end of an era of conflict. He returned to his colony with the certainty that, although there were still challenges ahead, his people were prepared to face them, for they had something that no weapon could destroy: unity and purpose. After the epic victory in the northern waters, Erik returned as a hero to his people. But the glory of battle soon gave way to the urgent need for reconstruction. Many ships had been lost, and the coastal lands damaged by the conflict needed attention. Erik, with his strategic vision, gathered the best artisans and local leaders to lead the restoration effort. He not only encouraged physical reconstruction, but also invested in strengthening the spirit of his community. Feasts were held to celebrate the peace, and the music of bards echoed through the village, recounting the courage of Erik and his people. With the temporary peace established, Erik decided it was time to consolidate his achievements into something greater. He called an assembly of leaders, not only from his colony, but also from neighboring lands that had been touched by his influence. In a passionate speech, he presented his vision: a unified kingdom where different clans and tribes could coexist under a common banner, sharing resources, defending each other, and prospering together. The idea was met with enthusiasm, but also with skepticism from some. To convince the more hesitant, Erik proposed marriage alliances and advantageous trade treaties, demonstrating his skill in politics as well as warfare. The founding of the new kingdom was not merely symbolic. It brought significant advancements to his people. Erik introduced systems of governance to ensure that decisions were made collectively, but with firm leadership. He established secure trade routes, linking his land with distant kingdoms, bringing wealth and new cultures to his lands. He also encouraged education and the arts, believing that an educated people would be the foundation of a strong and lasting kingdom. Before long, Erik's name was synonymous not only with victory in battle, but also with wisdom and prosperity. Yet he knew that each new step in power brought with it new challenges, and that the true test of leadership was just beginning. Years passed, and the kingdom that Erik had built became a symbol of strength and unity in the northern lands. Under his leadership, tribes that had once been enemies now lived together as allies, and the winds carried tales of a prosperous, fearless, and wise people. Erik, no longer so young, saw his days of battle behind him, but his warrior spirit remained alive. He spent his mornings training the new generation of fighters, sharing his strategies and life lessons. A leader is both a warrior and a guardian, he would say, his eyes shining, and true victory is leaving something greater than yourself behind. As the years passed, Erik began to prepare for his succession. He summoned his sons and advisors, instilling in them the values that had guided his life: justice, courage, and wisdom. He knew that if the kingdom was to survive the ages, it would have to be led by those who understood not only the art of war, but also the importance of peace. In a moving ceremony, Erik passed his legendary axe to his eldest son, Einar, naming him the new leader of the kingdom. But in doing so, he made it clear that his role as mentor and advisor would not end there. A leader's strength lies not in his weapons, but in the trust of his people, he declared, as the crowd cheered. In the final years of his life, Erik retired to a simple hut near the sea that had been the scene of so many of his victories. He spent his days in reflection, writing chronicles of his journeys and welcoming visitors from distant lands who sought to learn from his wisdom. On his final night, as the aurora borealis painted the sky, Erik gazed out at the horizon, sensing that his time had come. He departed silently, leaving behind a thriving kingdom, an immortal legend, and a people inspired by his bravery and vision. His name would echo through generations as the young Viking who became king, the leader who united clans, and the man who built a legacy as vast as the northern skies. Erik was not just a historical figure. He was a symbol of everything a Viking could aspire to be. And so his story lived on, told in every corner of the frozen lands, an inspiration to those who sought greatness. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.